When you hear the word wait, what kinds of things come to your mind? I was just talking to Barry about him going to the airport tomorrow, and he had a great time getting here yesterday. Uh, but when you wait, you have time to kill, and you can pull out your phone and scroll, and you can watch a movie on your iPad. And we talk about waiting in terms of this passive thing that we have to endure until we can get into the doctor's office or until we can get onto our plane or whatever it might be. When the Bible uses this phrase, wait for the Lord or wait on the Lord, it doesn't mean anything like the way that we use the word waiting. And what I want us to do in this lesson is scoop up several passages, and they're all going to be on the PowerPoint tonight, so that we can trace this theme. And we're going to look at several passages that uses this kind of idea. Some of these passages, a lot of them are going to come from the life of David in the book of Psalms. The book of Isaiah talks about waiting on the Lord as well, where they've been brought into this dark exile, and they have to wait on the Lord for him to act and take care of the problem. But have you ever had a fellow Christian encourage you to wait on the Lord? Or have you ever told another Christian that you need to wait on the Lord? I don't know that that's the kind of language that we use very often, but the Bible means something very particular when it uses this idea. I want us to begin by looking at this passage here in Psalm 25, verses 1 through 3. This is one of the, beginning around Psalm 22 through Psalm 29, David has these psalms that come one after another, a lot of them dealing with guidance and how we need God to be our light in the darkness. He's the shepherd in Psalm 23. This psalm, David is dealing with all kinds of enemies that are pressing in on him. And in those difficulties, he's asking God for guidance still. But look at how this psalm begins in Psalm 25, verses 1 through 3. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. In this psalm, we don't have all the historical background to this, but David is experiencing enemies in some way or another, and he's waiting for God to do something about this. Now, this Hebrew word that's used in this passage is something like kava or kava. I don't know how to pronounce that. But one definition of this word is something like this. A verb, notice that it's a verb meaning to wait for, to look for, to hope. Did you know that in Spanish, that the words hope and wait are like the same word? That there's a lot of parallels between this idea of hoping and what is Hebrews chapter 6? The only time that the Bible compares hope to something that's like tangible like that is hope is like an anchor. An anchor is something that gives you steadiness in the midst of a storm. It's this same kind of idea that while David is dealing with all of these enemies pressing in around him, he's going to wait for the Lord. He's going to anchor himself in God. Now, that's one way to think about that. Here's another definition of this that I found to be really helpful. Depending on and ordering activities around a future event, the hopes of someone can remain unfulfilled. Waiting, however, for what God has promised will not ultimately be disappointed, although it may not appear to succeed in the short run. Have you ever seen this with a Christian where they're putting their hope in God, but things keep seeming to get worse and worse? And in the immediate, it looks like everything's going to fall apart. But ultimately, the Christian's got his hope set on something in the ultimate future, and ultimately everything's going to be okay. Imagine that somebody, before they could get a surgery, this is a common thing that sometimes doctors will tell somebody to do, that before we can do the surgery on you, you need to lose 20 pounds. And so what would that waiting for that surgery look like? It would look like losing that weight, changing your diet, working out more. That's your waiting. It's a verb where you're fixated on this future event that you're hoping will be successful. Now, that's one way that we can think about this idea of waiting, but there's a couple other things to say about this. You could look at this from the perspective of the components of waiting. I think if we could try to distill waiting down to maybe 3 components or 3 steps, or however you'd want to say that, you could identify it like this. First of all, waiting on the Lord starts out with having a godly desire. I'm not going to go up to somebody and say, hey, how are you doing, brother? Oh, you're doing good. And then they ask how I'm doing. And I go, I'm doing pretty good. I'm just waiting on the Lord to know when to rob that bank. I'm waiting on the Lord to show vengeance. No, you start with a godly desire. And the second part of this is that desire is not fulfilled yet. That God's working on a different timetable than you are. I have a godly desire to be married. I have a godly desire to see that person converted. I have a godly desire to land that job, to provide for my family, but whatever it could be, and it's not yet fulfilled. What do people do when there's a gap between a godly desire and it's not fulfilled yet? That's what waiting on the Lord is. Some people fill that gap with anxiety, some people with worry. We're going to talk about some other things that would relate to that in just a moment. But do you remember when King David had this godly desire to build a house for the Lord? And God says no. In First Chronicles 22 to 29, what's David doing with the rest of his life until he dies? He's getting all the materials, all the plans ready so that the temple can be built. He's got this godly desire. He's not even going to be the one that's able to fulfill it. And that's what he's doing with his time. Now, the last thing then is that you remain faithful. Rather than filling that gap with anxiety, fear, taking things into your own hand or whatever, you don't justify sin. Now, just is what we're looking at so far. Have you ever seen somebody leave the Lord because they didn't know how to wait on God? Their impatience got the better of them. They couldn't stand it anymore, and so they go ahead and say, I'm done with this. And so that's another way that we could look at this idea. Here's another angle from all of this. These are just kind of observations about how this works. But there's two categories of waiting on the Lord. And the first category is that you're waiting with certainty. And these would be the kinds of things that I'm waiting on God, and God has explicitly said he's going to do this or that. Remember in Acts 23, verse 11, when Paul had been incarcerated, and Jesus appears to him and he says, take courage, you're going to testify to these people, but you're also going to testify in Rome. Is that a promise that Paul's been given? You're going to get to Rome. Now, can you imagine for a moment being Paul and the struggle of waiting on the Lord during that time? Like the next thing that happens is there's a plot to murder him. What would waiting on the Lord mean? He said, I'm going to get there. And then after that, he has to deal with Felix for a couple of years. God says, I'm eventually going to get there. And then there's a shipwreck, but God said, I'm eventually going to get there. And then they get to Malta, and there's this snake that has to bite him, but God says that I'm going to get there. What is waiting on the Lord for him? I know it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I can be certain because he's promised it. What would be some examples that would apply to the Christian? The second coming of Jesus, that there's coming a day where he's going to set all things right. And all the vengeance and the justice that we've been concerned weren't being meted out on this earth, he's going to eventually do something about all of that. And that in this place, there's going to be no more weeping and gnashing of teeth. There's not going to be, that's the description of hell, but there's not going to be any more tears. Have you ever heard somebody tell you before that everything's going to be okay? And they can just kind of be thrown out there like it's a trite statement. Do you know that for the Christian, because Jesus rose from the dead, everything actually will be okay one day? Everything is going to be okay eventually. But we have to wait on the Lord. So that's the first category, is that you're waiting on the Lord for things that God has explicitly promised. Now, there's this other category, and I think you can guess what it is. I think the second category is the place where we oftentimes struggle the most, and that's waiting with uncertainty. Where we're waiting on the Lord, we don't know what he's going to do. He's not explicitly said anything about this situation. Can you think of any times in the Bible where people were waiting on God for something, but God had not explicitly promised somebody such and such? Depending on how you read this, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. But maybe one that would be clearer. Remember when Paul was praying to God 3 times that the thorn in the flesh would be removed? Had God given him a clear answer that it's going to be taken away? No, but he keeps praying. So God, what are you going to do? But I'm waiting. I have a godly desire. I don't want this pain anymore. What are you going to do about this? And then in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Can you think of different ways today where we're waiting on the Lord and God's not promised you what you might want to have be fulfilled? Have you ever seen Christians who were single and they had a godly desire to be married and they kept waiting and waiting and waiting, and even they start maybe lowering their standards? They used to want somebody who was on the way to becoming an elder, and now they're okay with somebody who just knows where a church is, even if they're not going to that church. But God's not promised you a spouse, but I'm going to keep doing the right thing. What about when somebody gets married and then maybe they have infertility issues? God hasn't promised that you're going to be able to have children together, but that would be another thing that would be in that category. What about recovered health? Have you ever known any Christians that had constant pain, like excruciating all the time? I have a health issue that flares up about every 18 months or 2 years, and it's constant pain for about 3 weeks. I can't imagine living the rest of my life with constant pain. God, when are you going to take it away? When is it going to go away? Well, he's not explicitly promised that maybe it would. What about a career opportunity? Have you ever known an older Christian that's really faithful? And they don't know how or when they're going to die. They know they're going to be with the Lord when they die. That's the certain part, but they don't know how or when it's going to happen. And so they're waiting with uncertainty. I'm ready to go, but I don't know when all of this is actually going to happen. I don't know the timing of any of this. And so what's the idea of waiting on the Lord? That I'm fixated on this future thing. It's a godly desire that I have. It's not been fulfilled yet, but I'm not going to justify sinning in my impatience. This gets us into the thing that I want to talk about next. What are some of the challenges of being in a situation where we have to wait on the Lord? And by the way, there's a sense in which all of us are waiting, at least ultimately, for final judgment day. But all of us probably have godly desires that haven't been fulfilled in this life yet. So what are some of the challenges that this brings to us? I'm going to bring up several of these. One of them would be the temptation to help God. Can you think of any stories in the Bible where somebody had a godly desire and God's timetable was different? I think somebody said Abraham. Remember Abraham and Sarah, and then Hagar gets into the mix. That actually should say Abraham and Hagar. Sorry about that. But God's not keeping his promises on our timetable, whatever it might be. So let's go ahead and have a child through Hagar and see if that works out okay. What about when Moses went up to Mount Sinai? And what was he thinking? He was just up there too long. In Exodus 32, verse 1, when the people saw that Moses was delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us." The impatience that we don't control in our own hearts. We talk about, as we're talking about emotions, when somebody doesn't have desires that are fulfilled, they can try to take matters into their own hand. I'm sure there's some of you who have been waiting and waiting and waiting and getting tired. And it feels like Moses has been up on the mountain for a really long time. I'm not getting any answers. I don't know when anything is going to happen. Have you ever seen this happen with a single person who's not married? And they really want to have intimacy with somebody. And they go ahead and they're not even married, but they're starting to get sexually promiscuous. And this is not God's way of making these things happen in your life. What about a godly desire to see somebody be converted? And you start to get really forceful with this person. You're resorting to worldly ways. What about opportunities to serve? Is it a good thing if somebody wants to serve as an elder or a deacon? You know what happens sometimes in churches is, have you ever seen this happen where there's the announcement made that we're in election season for elders and deacons? And then suddenly, brother so-and-so is sitting way up front. And brother so-and-so is shaking babies and kissing hands. Or did I get that wrong? And he's just standing by the doors at the end right there with the preacher and, all these. Well, you weren't like that before the announcement. It's good if you want to serve, but not like that. you better actually grow into the kind of person God wants you to be. So ask yourself right now, if there's some kind of unfulfilled desire that you have in your life, is there some way in which you're tempted to help God along? Just find a shortcut. Here, how about another one? Falling into despair. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12 says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. Like, imagine having this deep hope that you have, and it keeps getting deferred. You want to be married, you want to have a child, you don't want to, and it just doesn't happen. What can happen to your heart? Get sick. Can you think of anybody in the Bible who was in a situation like that? She had a godly desire to have a child. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10, Hannah, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Remember, our emotions stem from our values, perceptions, and beliefs. She thinks it's valuable to have a child. It's a godly desire. It's not happening. My rival wife is having kids, and so I'm in despair because of this. There's a few days ago. Well, have any of you been praying for years and years about something, and it's not been affirmatively answered yet? There's a few days ago where my 8-year-old daughter put me to shame because we were driving home and she said, Dad, I want you to know that whenever I go to Bible class, and the teachers are asking for prayer requests, every single time for the last 3 quarters, I've been praying that your mom and dad would believe in the Bible. And she asked me the question. She said, Dad, do you pray for them every day that they would become Christians? I've been a Christian for 17 years. And I think I've fallen into despair about that one. Is there anything that you need to get back into prayer about? Anything that you need to keep proactively as a verb, waiting on the Lord, doing the thing that you know that you ought to do? What about another challenge? Doubting God's goodness. Have you ever seen somebody as they kept waiting and waiting and waiting, not knowing how things were going to work out, eventually go, you know what, maybe God's actually not good. Maybe God doesn't love me. Maybe God's not concerned about the things that are going on in my life. Do you remember the book of Habakkuk and how it opens up? Just feel the emotion of what Habakkuk is doing here. Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. You hear the ache of what's going on with Habakkuk? Asking God these questions. Why are you allowing wickedness in the nation? Why are you allowing violence? Can you imagine? It's one thing to look at a nation like ours and look at the news and see that there's violence. Can you imagine living as an Israelite and it's a theocracy and your kings are actually commanded to teach you the Bible? And you're looking out and going, how come that Israelite just murdered that Israelite? Looks like the law's paralyzed, God. It looks like nobody cares about anything that's right anymore. And you sit around looking idly at this. Look at the language that Habakkuk is using. In verse 2, the question, how long shall I cry to you and you not hear? Have you ever felt like your prayers weren't going any higher than the ceiling? I keep praying about these things and those things, and it seems like God's not doing anything with that. This world is filled with justice, or my personal life is filled with ugliness and darkness, and I keep praying, and not everything's getting better immediately. Do you know how the book of Habakkuk ends? God has this dialogue with Habakkuk, and he says, hey, Habakkuk, there's a lot of things that you have no idea that I'm doing. I'm taking a wicked nation, and I'm going to use them to discipline you guys because of all the wickedness that you guys have been committing. Look at how the book ends. I'll just go ahead and read this in Habakkuk 3:17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. By the way, verse 17 is bleak. We've got, even if everything was stripped away and everything was taken away, what do you think the next verse is going to say? He says this in verse 18, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord and take joy in the God of my salvation." That's waiting on the Lord. Have you ever been struggling to doubt whether or not God really loves you? Maybe failing to remember that God might have a lot of other things going on behind the scenes that you have no idea about, and one day you might know. I think those would be some of the challenges to waiting. How do we, though, learn to wait in a way that would be pleasing to God? Where we're not taking matters into our own hand, we're not falling into despair, we're not doubting God's goodness. I'm going to just bring up a couple things here. People have asked me whenever I wear this shirt if I'm preaching on Joseph, and this is the first time I think I can say. But there's a debate about that. Was it a coat of many colors, or did he have long sleeves? That's a worthy debate to have. I don't think it matters. All right. In Genesis chapter 39, Joseph has been put in prison. And it says in Genesis chapter 39, verses 21 to 23, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Can you imagine being put in prison because of false accusations made against you? And your focus here, this kind of reminds me of what Andy talked about in the book of Philippians, where Paul was in prison and his attitude was about service and helping other people. Here, Joseph has been put in prison, and he's so reliable and dependent and clearly not bitter that whatever he's doing, we don't have to double check it, nothing like that. Have you ever felt like you were put in some kind of prison? And I feel restricted right now, and I keep waiting and waiting, and I don't know what's going to happen. Well, what did Joseph do while he was waiting on the Lord? And by the way, was he waiting with certainty or uncertainty? Certainty. Do you remember in Genesis 37? He had that dream about all the grain falling before him, and that was a symbol that his brothers were going to bow down before. I have to imagine that those dreams anchored him. As he went through all of these different things, it gave him poise. And here he's serving while waiting. He's not just sitting there wondering, well, when is God going to fulfill his promises? I wish that these things would happen right now. Think about this in your life. When we moved to San Diego, shortly after we moved there, our firstborn Asher came into the world. And there was a woman at the church who was in her 50s at the time, who had never been married and very much wanted a child. And she walked around really bitter and angry that we had a kid and she didn't. No, she didn't. When Asher was born and we went home to our apartment, she, out of anybody else in the church, started bringing pots and pans and food to our house, and she would cook food in our house and let Samantha get a break. But when I remember very vividly, she walked into our apartment, she sat down and she said, "Can I hold him?" And we put Asher into Ida's hands, and she started singing Magnificat. I've never looked at that hymn the same way again. Here's a woman that wants to be married and wants to have children, and she's rejoicing in somebody else's child. What are you waiting for the Lord? Is it preventing you from seeing who you could encourage in front of you? Is it preventing you from doing things that you can do for other people right now? That's the first thing about learning how to wait well. Notice the second one is to surrender your timeline to God. And like many of the other Psalms of David, where he's going through some kind of trial with enemies, Psalm 31, verses 14 and 15, "But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from your persecutors." David realizes that I'm going through a lot of hardships right now. I think it's a pretty godly desire that I don't want these people trying to kill me all the time. But I'm going to acknowledge that my times belong to you. If you think about, we live in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and there's lots of farms there. And the farmers go out and they sow their seed. And if they go up to the soil and keep kind of jabbing it and like yelling at the soil, do you think that's going to make things grow quick? No, they do what they can do, but there's a lot of things that are outside of our control. David is like that here. I don't know how this is all going to work out, when it's all going to work out, but my times are in your hand. Think about it like this. All right, so here's the clicketizer. There's two ways that I could hold the clicketizer. Let's say that one of you wanted to come up and grab the clicketizer from, do you need this afterwards, by the way? You will need it. All right. So this is actually going to happen. All right. So I could either hold it like this, and when Brent comes up to get it, is it going to hurt me at all when he takes it? No. What if I'm holding it like this? And he gets it, it's going to come through a lot of pain. When it comes to our desires and the timetable that we want them fulfilled, are we holding our plans like this or like this? Have you ever seen people get really heartbroken because they just knew how everything needed to work out and they had everything lined up and it didn't work out that way? It's going to come through a lot more pain. If you hold your plans with an open palm and say, God, my life is yours. I want this, but it might not always be in my life. My times are in your hands. One of my favorite quotes that is not in the Bible is that God is always almost late. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. Is there any temptation that you have to repay evil with evil? God's going to take care. Daddy's coming home one day, and he's going to take care of all the problems. That's one thing that old moms used to say to their kids when they were acting up. Daddy's coming home, and he's going to settle the accounts. That's what I mean by saying that. Notice, final thing, is to cultivate thankfulness. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Give thanks in all circumstances, even when I have godly desires that haven't been fulfilled yet. Yeah, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. I don't know if this is as much a common thing in society anymore, but when I was a newer Christian, people would always be asking the question, what's God's will for my life? And maybe he's revealing to me through feelings or signs or bumper stickers or whatever, that this is what God wants me to do in my life. And then there's passages that just say it. This is what God's will is for you, that you learn how to be a thankful person in all circumstances. It's easy to do when things are going well, but it's worship when things are hard. How do we cultivate thanksgiving in any circumstance? Have you ever noticed that throughout the New Testament letters? I remember one time I was reading 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, and I was struck by this. Because Paul had started the church in Thessalonica, and he was driven out, and I don't know how much longer afterwards he wrote that letter. But he's getting mistreated by people all over the place, and he starts out in 1 Thessalonians 1, and he doesn't talk about how bitter he is. Guys, pray for me. I'm really angry right now. Which would be okay if you're being vulnerable, all that kind of. But he begins it by saying, I'm so thankful to God for you guys. When was the last time you just wrote, if you needed to do this, write down a list of all of God's people that you've really appreciated that he's put into your life? I think the list might be longer than we might sometimes think. What about all the provisions that God has given you? So I'm 36 years old, so I've been alive for over 13,000 days. And God's given me, to this point, everything that I've ever needed. Count your many blessings. What about the spiritual blessings? Remembering who we belong to. Have you ever looked at the different titles God gives us? Like just in the book of Ephesians, that we're saints, we're redeemed, we're forgiven, we're adopted, we're saved. All of these great things that are true about us. Do you think that would help us cultivate thankfulness rather than just only always fixating on the unmet desires we have? Here's what God has already done. And that's why I can come to you, and before the prayer is even answered, I can pray with thanksgiving because of what you've done for me in the past. In the book of Isaiah, the Israelites were facing the reality of exile. And one of the things that Isaiah famously says in Isaiah 40, verse 31, they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. You know what I wonder about this passage? Is Isaiah talking about people who, when the first readers of this would have been in exile, and Isaiah is talking about, you guys deserved judgment, you're in exile for a reason, but eventually God is going to reverse all of these things, and while you're in exile, if you wait on the Lord, is it going to change what you are right now? Are you going to have some strength in Babylon that maybe you didn't have before? If you start fixating, I know you have godly desires of wanting to be back in Jerusalem, but wait on the Lord. Don't take matters into your own hands. And you'll start finding a kind of strength that you didn't know that you had. We're about to sing this song, Nothing But the Blood. If you're here tonight and you know